Princess Lyra stood at the viewing window of the diplomatic vessel, watching the stars streak past as they traveled through hyperspace, and she felt the weight of her mission pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden that grew heavier. With each passing moment, the humans had requested this meeting after years of tension between the Elven kingdoms and the growing human federation, and Lyra had been chosen as the ambassador because she was young and represented the new generation that believed cooperation was possible between their two peoples. Her mother, the queen, had dressed her in the finest ceremonial robes that the royal weavers could create, and the silk was so delicate, it seemed to float around her body like morning. Mist and the silver threads woven through the fabric caught the light and made her look like a creature made of moonbeams and stardust. Beside her in their special travel cage, Ember and Frost were curled together, sleeping peacefully after the excitement of boarding the ship, and Lyra smiled at them, remembering how nervous she had been when her mother first gave her the dragon eggs on her 18th birthday 3 months ago. The eggs had hatched within days, and the tiny dragons had imprinted on her, immediately following her everywhere, and learning to understand her words even though they could not yet speak themselves. And now they were her constant companions, and the only beings she truly trusted with her deepest fears about this mission. Captain Hayes was a stern woman who ran her ship with military precision, and she had made it clear from the beginning that she did not approve of having royalty aboard, especially royalty that came with baby dragons and strange elven customs that her crew did not understand, but orders were orders, and the captain had been commanded by the Human Federation Council to transport Princess Lyra safely to the neutral station where the peace talks would be held. And so she did her duty, even if she did it with a permanent frown on her weathered face. Lyra had tried to be friendly with the crew during the 3-day journey, but most of them kept their distance, and she could see the curiosity and suspicion in their eyes when they thought she was not looking, and she understood that decades of mistrust could not be erased with smiles and polite greetings. The ship's communications officer was a young woman named Beth, who was different from the others, and she had approached Lyra on our second day asking questions about the elven homeworld and the dragons and whether it was true that elven princesses could sing songs that made plants grow faster. Lyra had laughed at that last question and explained that while some elves had gifts with growing things, she personally could barely keep a potted flower alive, and Beth had laughed too, and suddenly the ice between them began to melt. They talked for hours that day, and Beth explained that she had always been fascinated by other cultures and had joined the exploration service specifically to meet new peoples and learn their ways. And Lyra felt hope blooming in her chest because if one human could be this open-minded, then perhaps peace was truly possible. On the 3rd day, everything changed in a heartbeat that Lyra would remember for the rest of her life. The alarm klaxon started screaming throughout the ship, and the artificial gravity flickered, making Lyra stumble and grab the wall for support, and Ember and Frost woke instantly, their small bodies tense and ready to flee from danger. They could sense but not understand. Captain Hayes' voice came over the intercom, tense and clipped, as she ordered all personnel to battle stations and told Lyra to get to the escape pods immediately and to bring her dragons with her. Lyra ran through the corridors, her ceremonial robes tangling around her legs and making her trip twice before she gathered the fabric up in one hand while carrying the dragon cage in the other, and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear nothing else. The ship shuddered violently and the lights went out, leaving only the emergency red glow that made everything look like it was covered in blood. And somewhere in the distance, she heard explosions and the terrible sound of hull breaches as atmosphere screamed out into the void. Beth appeared out of the darkness, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her toward the nearest escape pod bay, and she was shouting something about raiders and ambush and how they had dropped out of hyperspace right into a trap. The escape pod bay was chaos, with crew members rushing to get into the small survival craft, and Captain Hayes was there directing traffic and making sure everyone got to safety even as the ship continued to shake itself apart around them. Beth shoved Lyra toward one of the pods and helped her strap in while securing the dragon cage to the seat beside her, and she was moving so fast her hands were shaking, and Lyra wanted to ask what was happening, but there was no time. The captain appeared at the pod door, her face grim, and she told Lyra that the attackers were unknown hostiles who were not responding to any communication attempts, and that the diplomatic vessel was lost, but Lyra would survive to complete her mission another day. Before Lyra could respond, the captain slammed the pod door shut and hit the launch button, and suddenly Lyra was pressed back into her seat as the pod shot away from the dying ship like a bullet from a gun. Through the small window she watched in horror as the diplomatic vessel exploded in a ball of fire that expanded silently in the vacuum of space, and she saw other escape pods scattering in all directions like seeds blown from a dandelion. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold, and it was the raider ships moving through the debris field and systematically destroying the escape pods one by one with precise weapons fire that left no survivors. Lyra tried to make her pod change course or go faster, but the controls were locked into automatic mode, and all she could do was watch helplessly as the raiders worked their way closer to her position. Ember and Frost were crying out in distress, feeling her fear, and she tried to calm them even as her own panic threatened to overwhelm her completely. The pod suddenly lurched and began spinning wildly as something struck it, and alarms started blaring inside the tiny space, and Lyra realized she had been hit by debris or weapons fire, and the pod was no longer responding to its navigational programming. The spinning got worse and worse until Lyra could not tell up from down, and she held onto the dragon cage with both hands and prayed to the old gods that her people had worshipped for thousands of years. Then the pod hit something solid and everything went black. When Lyra finally regained consciousness, she did not know how much time had passed, and her head was throbbing with pain, and there was blood on her face from a cut above her eyebrow. The pod was tilted at a strange angle, and through the window, she could see white and more white, and she realized with growing dread that she had crashed on some kind of ice world. Ember and Frost were awake and unhurt, just frightened, and they pressed against the cage bars trying to get to her. The pod door was jammed, but after several minutes of desperate pulling, it finally gave way and frigid air rushed in, stealing her breath. The cold hit Lyra like a physical wall, and she gasped as the frozen air filled her lungs and made them burn with each breath she took, and she realized immediately that she was in terrible danger because her ceremonial robes were beautiful, but they were never meant for survival in extreme conditions. She grabbed the dragon cage and climbed out of the pod, stumbling onto the ice and snow that covered everything as far as she could see in every direction, and the landscape was completely white except for the black of the sky above and the wreckage of her escape pod behind her. Ember and Frost were shivering already despite their natural heat, and Lyra opened the cage door and lifted them out, holding them against her chest under her outer robe where they pressed close to her body seeking warmth. The wind was brutal and constant, and it tore at her clothes and hair with invisible claws, and Lyra knew she could not stay here in the open, or she would freeze to death within hours. She looked around desperately, trying to see anything that might offer shelter, and finally she spotted what looked like dark shapes against the white snow in the distance, and she began walking toward them, even though each step was agony as the cold bit through her thin slippers. The wind grew stronger as she walked, and several times it nearly knocked her down, and the fabric of her robes was already becoming stiff with ice. As the moisture from the snow froze solid, Ember tried to breathe, a small flame to warm her. But he was still too young, and the flame was weak and lasted only a moment before going out. And Lyra kissed the top of his small head and told him it was all right, and that he should save his strength. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Lyra reached the dark shapes and saw with relief that they were rock formations, and among them was the entrance to a cave that looked deep enough to provide real shelter from the killing wind. She stumbled into the cave and collapsed against the stone wall, her legs finally giving out from exhaustion and cold, and she sat there holding the dragons and trying to catch her breath while her mind raced with thoughts of what she needed to do to survive. The cave was dark, but it was warmer than outside simply because the wind could not reach her here, and Lyra carefully set Ember and Frost down and told them to stay close while she explored their new shelter. The cave went back about 20 feet and was mostly dry except for some ice formations near the entrance, and in the back corner Lyra found patches of dry moss growing on the walls and some small twigs and debris that must have blown in during past storms. She gathered everything she could find and brought it to the middle of the cave and arranged it carefully the way her brother had taught her during survival training, that the royal family had insisted all children learn, even though most of them never expected to use it. Then came the hardest decision she had ever faced in her young life. Lyra looked down at her ceremonial robes and saw how they were wet from the snow and already freezing solid against her skin, and she knew that if she kept wearing them, she would die from hypothermia before morning. But these robes were a gift from her mother, and they marked her as royalty, and taking them off would leave her exposed and vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical cold. She thought about her mother and what the Queen would say, and then she thought about Ember and Frost, who depended on her completely and who would die if she died. The choice became clear. Lyra began removing the layers of her robes, starting with the outer ceremonial coat that was the most frozen and damaged, and she worked quickly before she could change her mind. The outer robe came off and she spread it on the cave floor, then the middle layer, and finally she was down to just her thin undergarments that were little more than a slip, and she was shaking violently from cold and shock at what she had just done. But there was no time for shame or second thoughts, because Ember and Frost needed her, and she needed them. She took the outer robe and tore it into strips using a sharp rock. She found, and then she made a nest with the driest pieces and placed the dragons inside, wrapping them carefully so only their heads poked out. They protested with small chirps and tried to get back to her, but she spoke to them firmly and told them they needed to stay warm and that she needed them to help her very soon. Then Lyra arranged the moss and twigs in a small pile and coaxed Ember to breathe his flame onto it, and after several tries the moss finally caught, and a small fire began to grow. She fed it carefully, adding more moss and the smaller twigs, and gradually the fire grew stronger and began to push back the darkness, and cold Lyra wrapped herself in the middle layer of her robe, which was slightly less wet, and sat as close to the fire as she could without burning herself, and slowly feeling began to return to her fingers and toes, though it came with terrible pain. The dragons were warm in their nest, and the fire was burning steadily, and Lyra allowed herself to hope that maybe she could survive this nightmare. But survival meant more than just getting through one night, and she knew she needed to think about water and food, and how long she could last in this cave before she either starved or the cold claimed her anyway. She looked at her bare arms and legs and saw that her skin had taken on a bluish tint that she knew was dangerous, and she rubbed them, trying to restore circulation. While staying close to the precious fire, hours passed and Lyra dozed, fitfully waking every few minutes to add more fuel to the fire and check on the dragons who were sleeping peacefully in their warm nest. She thought about Beth and Captain Hayes and the rest of the crew, and wondered if any of them had survived the attack, and whether anyone would come looking for survivors, or if the raiders had destroyed everything so completely that the Federation would assume there were no witnesses left alive. The night seemed to last forever, but finally, Lyra noticed that the darkness outside the cave was becoming slightly less complete, and she realized dawn must be coming. She ventured to the cave entrance and looked out at the frozen landscape, and saw that the wind had died down slightly, and the sky was growing lighter, though it was still gray and threatening. Movement in the distance caught her eye, and Lyra froze, her heart pounding as she tried to see what it was. At first she thought it might be an animal, but then she saw the distinctive shape of a spacecraft coming in for a landing about half a mile from her cave. Hope and fear warred in her chest, because it could be rescuers, but it could also be the raiders coming to finish what they started. Lyra ducked back into the cave and quickly added more fuel to the fire and checked on Ember and Frost, who were waking up and stretching their small wings. She had to decide whether to hide and hope they passed by, or reveal herself and risk everything on the chance that they were friendly. But then Ember let out a loud chirp that echoed from the cave walls and carried out into the frozen air, and Lyra knew the decision had been made for her. Lyra heard footsteps crunching through the snow outside the cave, and her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to decide what to do, and Ember and Frost pressed against her legs, sensing her fear, and ready to defend her despite being so small. They could barely harm a field mouse. The footsteps stopped just outside the cave entrance, and Lyra could see a shadow falling across the snow, and then a voice called out in common tongue, asking if anyone was inside and whether they needed help. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded concerned rather than threatening. But Lyra had learned that danger could wear many faces, and she hesitated while her mind raced through possibilities. The voice called out again, saying that she had detected life signs and asking again if someone needed assistance, and that she was alone and meant no harm. Lyra made her decision and stepped toward the cave entrance, still wrapped in her torn robe and holding herself as tall as she could despite being barely dressed and freezing. She emerged into the pale morning light and saw a human woman standing there wearing thick thermal gear and holding a scanning device, and the woman's eyes went wide when she saw Lyra. The woman was young, probably only a few years older than Lyra herself, and she had kind eyes and short brown hair that stuck out from under her thermal hood, and her face showed genuine shock and concern as she took in Lyra's condition. For a moment, neither of them moved, and then the woman was pulling off her own thermal jacket and rushing forward to wrap it around Lyra's shoulders, and she was speaking rapidly, asking what happened and how long Lyra had been out here, and whether she was injured. Lyra tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak, and the woman whose name tag read Beth Wilson seemed to understand and simply took Lyra's arm and began leading her toward the spacecraft. Ember and Frost chirped loudly and scrambled out of the cave, following Lyra and not wanting to be left behind, and Beth stopped and stared at them with wonder in her eyes. "Are those dragons?" she asked, and her voice held such genuine excitement and curiosity that Lyra found herself smiling despite everything. "Yes," Lyra managed to say through her chattering teeth. "They are Ember and Frost, and they need warmth too." Beth nodded and scooped up both dragons with surprising gentleness and tucked them inside her thermal vest, where they immediately snuggled against her body heat and made contented sounds. "Come on," Beth said, "we need to get you all inside before you freeze." And she supported Lyra as they walked across the ice toward her ship. The spacecraft was small and clearly designed for solo research missions, and Beth helped Lyra up the boarding ramp and into the warm interior, and the sudden heat made Lyra dizzy, and she would have fallen if Beth had not caught her. Beth guided her to a seat and wrapped her in thermal blankets that felt like heaven against her frozen skin, and then she brought hot liquid in a container and held it to Lyra's lips, telling her to drink slowly. The liquid burned going down, but it was the best thing Lyra had ever tasted, and she could feel warmth spreading through her body from the inside, and gradually the violent shaking began to subside. Beth set Ember and Frost on a cushioned seat and gave them small pieces of dried meat which they devoured eagerly, and then she turned her attention back to Lyra and began scanning her with medical equipment. "You have mild hypothermia," Beth said, "but nothing that warmth and rest will not fix." And she paused, looking at Lyra's torn robes that were piled on the floor where they had fallen, when Beth added more blankets. "What happened to you?" Beth asked gently. "Who are you, and why were you out there alone?" Lyra took a deep breath and began telling her story, starting with the diplomatic mission and the attack and the escape pod crash, and Beth listened without interrupting her expression, growing more serious with each detail. When Lyra finished, Beth sat back and let out a long breath. "The diplomatic vessel," she said. "I heard about that mission, but there was no distress call, no indication that anything went wrong. And the Federation thinks the ship is still en route to the neutral station. They do not know about the attack," Lyra asked, and her heart sank, because that meant the raiders had succeeded in their goal of preventing the peace talks. Beth shook her head. "No one knows, and I am just a xenobiologist doing ice core research on this moon, and I was not even supposed to land here, but my sensors picked up something unusual, and I decided to investigate." She looked at Lyra with concern. "If I had not decided to check that sensor reading, you would have died out there." Lyra felt tears burning in her eyes, and she blinked them back, refusing to break down now that she was safe. "The dragons saved me," she said. "If I had not needed to keep them warm, I might have given up, but they needed me, so I had to keep fighting." Beth smiled and reached over to stroke Ember's head gently. "They are beautiful," she said, "and clearly very attached to you." Lyra nodded. "They hatched for me 3 months ago, and they are my responsibility." Beth stood and moved to the ship's control panel. "I need to get you to a medical facility," she said, "and report what happened, but the nearest station is 2 days away." She paused and looked back at Lyra. "There is something you should know. The neutral station, where the peace talks were supposed to happen, is in this system, and we could reach it in 6 hours. Lyra sat up straighter despite the blankets. "What are you saying?" Beth met her eyes. "I am saying that if you still want to complete your mission, I can get you there, but you would be arriving alone without your ship or your crew and wearing borrowed clothes instead of your ceremonial robes." She hesitated. "And what I am really asking is whether peace between our peoples is worth continuing this mission, even though everything went wrong." Lyra thought about Captain Hayes and the crew who had died protecting her, and she thought about her mother who had trusted her with this important task, and she thought about Beth, who represented exactly the kind of human that made peace possible. She looked down at Ember and Frost, who were watching her with their intelligent eyes, and she knew what her answer had to be. Take me to the neutral station. Lyra said I came here to build a bridge between our peoples, and I will not let raiders and assassins stop that from happening. Beth grinned and turned back to her controls. Then let us go make history. Princess Lyra. But first, Beth added, turning back with a more serious expression. We need to get you some proper clothes, because showing up to peace talks in thermal blankets might send the wrong message despite everything. Lyra laughed, and it felt good to laugh after so much fear and cold and death. Beth moved to a storage locker and pulled out a spare jumpsuit. It is not fancy, she said, but it will fit, and it is warm and practical. Lyra took the jumpsuit gratefully, and Beth gave her privacy to change, and when she emerged wearing the simple gray clothing, she looked nothing like a princess, but she felt stronger somehow. Beth was preparing the ship for launch, and she looked over her shoulder. You know, she said, when we get to the station, there are going to be a lot of questions about what happened and about why a xenobiologist is bringing an elven princess to peace talks. Lyra nodded. I know, and I will tell them the truth, that sometimes the most important meetings happen by accident, and that peace requires us to help each other, even when it is not convenient. The ship lifted off smoothly, and soon they were climbing through the atmosphere, leaving the frozen moon behind. The journey to the neutral station took exactly 6 hours, as Beth had predicted, and during that time Lyra cleaned herself up as best she could and tried to prepare mentally for what was coming next. Beth had given her access to the small bathroom on the ship, and Lyra had washed the blood from her face and combed her silver hair until it fell smoothly down her back, and she looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. She was no longer wearing ceremonial robes that marked her as royalty, and her skin still had a pale cast from the cold exposure, and there was a healing cut above her eyebrow that would probably leave a small scar. But her eyes were clear and determined, and she knew that she had survived, something that should have killed her and that made her stronger than she had been before. Ember and Frost were sleeping peacefully on the bunk, wrapped in a thermal blanket, and making small snoring sounds that would have been funny in any other situation. Beth came to check on her and found Lyra staring at her reflection. You look good, she said, considering what you have been through. Lyra turned to face her. I look like a survivor, not a princess. Beth smiled. Maybe that is what the peace talks need right now, a survivor who knows the cost of conflict. As they approached the neutral station, Beth made contact with the station authority and requested permission to dock, and Lyra could hear the confusion in the controller's voice when Beth explained who she was bringing. Within minutes, the communication channels were flooded with urgent messages and demands for explanations, and Beth calmly repeated the basic facts while refusing to give more details until they were docked. The station was enormous, and Lyra could see it growing larger in the view screen, and it was a massive ring that rotated slowly to create artificial gravity, and ships of all sizes were docked at various points around its circumference. Beth guided her small research vessel to an assigned docking port, and as they made their final approach, Lyra could see armed security personnel waiting at the airlock. Take a deep breath. Beth said they are going to ask a lot of questions, but remember, you did nothing wrong, and you are here for the right reasons. Lyra nodded and gathered Ember and Frost, who were now awake and sensing the tension in the air, and they climbed onto her shoulders and wrapped their tails around her neck for security. The airlock cycled, and the door opened, and immediately Lyra and Beth were surrounded by security officers, all speaking at once and demanding identification and explanations. A tall man in a commander's uniform pushed through the crowd and held up his hand for silence, and his name tag identified him as Commander Grant, and he had the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in military service. Princess Lyra, he said, and his voice was formal, but not unkind. We received word from your mother, the Queen, approximately 4 hours ago that your diplomatic vessel had been destroyed and that there were no survivors. He paused, looking at her with something like wonder. Can you explain how you are here and alive? Lyra straightened her spine and spoke clearly. I survived because I got to an escape pod before the ship exploded, and I crashed on the frozen moon in this system, and I survived there until Beth found me and brought me here. The commander's eyes moved to Beth, who stood quietly beside Lyra. And you are Beth, Wilson, xenobiologist assigned to Ice Core Research Project, 7 Alpha, yes. Sir Beth said I was conducting routine scans when I detected life signs and decided to investigate. Commander Grant looked between them for a long moment, and then he made a decision. All security personnel except my personal guard are dismissed, and he turned to Lyra. And Beth, please follow me, we have much to discuss. They were led through the station corridors, and Lyra noticed that people stopped and stared as they passed, and she could hear whispers following in their wake, and she held her head high and refused to show any uncertainty. The commander brought them to a conference room where several important-looking people were already waiting, and Lyra recognized some of them from the briefing materials she had studied before the mission. There was Ambassador Rodriguez from the Human Federation Council, and there was also a holographic projection of an elven elder from the High Council back on the homeworld Princess, Lyra the elder said, and her voice carried both relief and concern. We thought you lost to us. I nearly was, Lyra replied. But I am here now, and I wish to continue the mission if the humans are still willing to talk. Ambassador Rodriguez leaned forward. We are more than willing, Princess, but we need to understand what happened. And who attacked your vessel. Lyra spent the next hour recounting everything she remembered about the attack and the escape and her time on the frozen moon. And Beth added her own observations and technical data from her ship's sensors. When Lyra finished, there was silence in the room, and then Ambassador Rodriguez spoke again. What you are describing sounds like a coordinated attack by forces that want to prevent peace between our peoples. The Elven Elder agreed and added there are factions on both sides who profit from continued distrust and conflict. Commander Grant pulled up a star map and pointed to several locations we have had reports of unusual ship movements in this sector, and I believe the raiders may still be in the area. He looked at Lyra, which means you may still be in danger. Princess Lyra felt Ember and Frost tense on her shoulders, but she kept her voice steady. I did not survive freezing to death, just to hide now. And she looked at each person in the room. The fact that someone tried to stop these talks only proves how important they are. Ambassador Rodriguez smiled. You are very different from what I expected, Princess. Most of the Elven royalty we have dealt with were more concerned with protocol than substance. Lyra thought about stripping off her ceremonial robes in that freezing cave. And she said, I learned on that frozen moon that survival requires letting go of things that do not matter so we can focus on what does and what matters. She continued, is building a future where humans and elves can work together instead of viewing each other with suspicion. Beth spoke up for the first time since entering the conference room. If I may say something, she began, and everyone turned to look at her. I spent 6 hours with Princess Lyra on my ship, and I can tell you that she is genuine in her desire for peace. She paused and added, I also think that the fact that she survived such a terrible ordeal and still wants to continue the mission says more about her character than any ceremonial robes ever could. The Elven Elder studied Lyra through the hologram and finally nodded. Very well. Princess Lyra, you have our permission to continue with the peace talks, Ambassador. Rodriguez also nodded and said the Human Federation Council agrees, but we must provide you with proper security and accommodations. Lyra shook her head respectfully. I do not need luxury accommodations. She said what I need is a chance to sit down with human representatives and talk honestly about how we can build trust between our peoples. She looked at Beth and added, I already know it is possible because Beth saved my life even though she had no obligation to do so. And that is the kind of cooperation we need to foster on a larger scale. Commander Grant spoke up again. Princess Lyra is right, but we cannot ignore the security threat. And I recommend we move the talks to a more secure location within the station. Everyone agreed, and the meeting began to break up, and as people filed out, Ambassador Rodriguez approached Lyra privately. You have courage, Princess, he said softly. Not many would have survived what you went through, and even fewer would have the strength to continue the mission afterward. Lyra looked down at Ember and Frost, who were finally relaxing on her shoulders. I had help, she said, and besides, giving up was never an option. The peace talks began the next morning in a secure conference room deep within the station, and Lyra sat across from Ambassador Rodriguez and 3 other human representatives, while the Elven High Council participated through holographic projection. Beth had been allowed to stay as an observer at Lyra's request, and she sat quietly in the corner with Ember and Frost, who had taken a liking to her and refused to leave her lap. The first hour was tense, with both sides carefully testing each other's intentions and bringing up old grievances that had been festering for decades. But then Ambassador Rodriguez did something unexpected, and he asked Lyra to tell everyone in the room exactly what had happened to her from the moment of the attack. To her rescue, Lyra hesitated, wondering if this was some kind of trap. But then she saw genuine curiosity in the ambassador's eyes, and she began to speak. She told them everything, holding nothing back, and when she reached the part about stripping off her ceremonial robes to save the dragons, she saw several of the human representatives lean forward with interest. "Why did you do that?" Ambassador Rodriguez asked. "Why risk your own life for 2 baby dragons?" "Because they trusted me," Lyra said simply, "and because they were innocent and helpless, and because in that moment, nothing else mattered except survival." She paused and added also, "Because my brother taught me that survival requires making hard choices, and that dignity is not about what you wear, but about what you do when everything is stripped away." One of the other human representatives, a woman named Kelly, spoke up. "I think what Princess Lyra experienced is a metaphor for what our 2 peoples need to do." Everyone turned to look at her, and she continued, "We need to strip away all the ceremonial pretense and the old grudges and the artificial barriers between us, and focus on what really matters, which is building a future where we can help each other survive and thrive." The elven elder, who had been silent until now, spoke through the hologram. "Kelly is correct, and I believe that Princess Lyra's ordeal has taught us all an important lesson about what true cooperation looks like." She looked at Lyra with pride in her ancient eyes. "You did not wait for a formal rescue mission. Princess, you accepted help from whoever was willing to give it, and you trusted a stranger because you had no other choice. And that trust," Lyra said, looking at Beth, "was rewarded because Beth did not see an elven princess, she saw someone who needed help." Beth blushed but nodded. "It is true," she said, "I did not care about politics or history when I found Lyra. I just saw someone in trouble. That is exactly the attitude we need," Ambassador Rodriguez said, and he looked around the room at everyone present. "I propose that we structure these peace talks around practical cooperation rather than abstract treaties." "What do you mean?" another human representative asked. Rodriguez leaned forward. "I mean, instead of arguing about territorial rights or trade percentages, we should focus on joint projects where humans and elves work together to solve real problems." He pulled up a holographic display showing various star systems that need disaster relief, ships that need crews, research projects that need funding. And he continued, "There are 100 ways our peoples could help each other if we stop viewing every interaction as a potential threat." The elven elder considered this, and then nodded slowly. "I believe this approach has merit, and perhaps Princess Lyra and Beth could serve as the first official human-elf cooperation team." Lyra looked at Beth with surprise, and Beth looked equally shocked, but also excited by the possibility. "What would this team do?" Kelly asked. "They would work together on a project that benefits both peoples," the elder said, "and they would serve as proof that cooperation is not only possible, but beneficial." Commander Grant entered the conversation from where he had been. Standing by the door, "I have a suggestion." He said, "The raiders who attacked the diplomatic vessel are still at large, and tracking them down would serve both our people's interests." He looked at Lyra and Beth. "Your survival, Princess, proves that the raiders failed in their primary objective, but they may try again. And having a team that combines elven diplomatic authority with human military resources could help us find them before they strike again." Lyra felt her heart race at the suggestion. "You want us to hunt down the raiders?" "Not hunt exactly," Grant said, "but investigate and gather intelligence, and Beth's research vessel is small enough to avoid detection while still being capable of long-range scans." Beth spoke up. "I signed up to study. Ice Corps not chase criminals, but you also signed up to explore and meet new peoples," Rodriguez said, "and this would give you a chance to do both, while also preventing future attacks." The elder looked at Lyra. "The choice is yours, Princess. You have already done more than anyone could have asked." Lyra thought about Captain Hayes and the crew who had died in the attack, and she thought about how close she had come to dying alone on that frozen moon. Then she thought about the future, where humans and elves work together instead of apart, and where raiders and terrorists could not destroy peace efforts because both peoples were committed to protecting them together. "I will do it," Lyra said. "But only if Beth agrees to work with me." All eyes turned to Beth, who sat there with a baby dragon sleeping in each of her arms, and she looked at Lyra and smiled. "I did not save your life just to let you go off alone," she said, "so yes, I will work with you." The room erupted in conversation as the representatives began discussing logistics and resources and security protocols. Over the next 3 hours, they hammered out the details of the first official human-elf cooperation mission, and it would be led by Lyra and Beth with support from both governments. They would track the raiders using Beth's research vessel and Lyra's diplomatic authority, and they would gather evidence that could be used to bring the attackers to justice. Ambassador Rodriguez stood as the meeting concluded. "This is historic," he said. "Not just the peace talks, but the fact that an elven princess and a human scientist will be working together as equals." Lyra stood as well, with Ember and Frost now perched on her shoulders, and she looked at everyone in the room. "I came here expecting to give speeches and sign documents," she said. "But instead I learned that real peace is built through actions, not words." She paused and continued. "Beth saved my life without asking for anything in return. And now we have a chance to build something bigger than either of us, and that is what I want our peoples to remember when they look back at this moment." The meeting ended, and as people filed out, Beth came over to Lyra, looking both excited and nervous. "Are you sure about this?" Beth asked. "We barely know each other, and now we are supposed to hunt down space raiders together." Lyra laughed. "We survived a frozen moon together. I think we can handle anything else that comes our way. Besides," she added, gesturing to Ember and Frost, who were stretching their wings, "we have dragons." Beth grinned. "Even if they are still too small to be scary, they will grow," Lyra promised. "And so will the partnership between our peoples." As they left the conference room to begin planning their mission, Lyra felt something she had not felt since before the attack, and it was hope, real, genuine hope that maybe peace was possible after all. Not because of treaties or ceremonies, but because two people from different worlds had chosen to trust each other and work together. And sometimes Lyra thought that is all it takes to change everything.